Okay, let's talk about the Siege of Mafeking. It's one of those stories that's just etched into British history, right? A 207-day epic of pure resilience, of pluck, of defiance against just overwhelming odds. I mean, it's a story of heroism that gave birth to a national hero and even sparked a global movement. But what if I told you that's only half the story? Not even half, really. So, when the news that the siege was finally over reached London, the city just erupted. The celebration was so completely wild, so frenzied, that it literally created a new word in the English language. To maffick. Yeah, it means to celebrate extravagantly and in public. After a whole string of defeats, you have to understand this was the victory the nation was absolutely desperate for. I mean, think about it, 217 days. For 217 days, this tiny British garrison held out against a much, much larger Boer force. And this incredible feat of endurance, it just completely captured the public's imagination. It became this powerful symbol of British grit during the Second Boer War. But what if that famous story, the one about all the heroism, is hiding a much, much darker reality? That's really the question we're digging into here. Because hiding underneath this celebrated legend is a story that was, well, deliberately ignored. A story of calculated policy, of racial hierarchy, and of mass starvation. All right, so first, let's look at the story the way the world was told it. This is the official version, the narrative of Colonel Robert Baden-Powell, the super charismatic commander who became the first huge hero of the war. And the official praise for him was just off the charts. You had official reports praising Baden-Powell at the absolute highest levels for his resolution, judgment, and resource. He was hailed as this brilliant, incredibly resourceful commander who used every single ounce of his cunning to hold that town. His real genius, it seemed, was all about managing morale. So get this, the Boers usually didn't shell on Sundays. So what does Baden-Powell do? He turns Sunday into this festival of distractions for the white residents. We're talking polo, cricket, concerts. There was even a baby shell. And Baden-Powell himself would get up on stage and perform as a comedian. At the same time, against the Boers, he's using all these clever tricks, like building dummy forts to draw their fire. It was an absolute masterclass in psychological warfare, not just against the enemy, but against the feeling of despair inside the town. Now, this heroic narrative, it didn't just appear out of nowhere. Oh no, it was expertly crafted and then amplified by journalists who were right there, inside the siege. The most famous was probably Lady Sarah Wilson, who was writing for the Daily Mail. So back home, the British public is reading these absolutely thrilling dispatches about the plucky defenders and their genius commander, and they just ate it up. They were completely captivated. Okay, but here's the first real crack in the legend. From a purely military perspective, was the siege even that important? A lot of historians now argue that the Boers made a massive strategic mistake here. By getting totally bogged down besieging Mafeking, they just wasted time, men, and ammunition on what was, really, in the grand scheme of the war, a strategic sideshow. But honestly, the biggest crack in the legend isn't about military strategy at all. It's this. While the white residents were playing cricket and having baby shows, a completely different siege was happening for the thousands of Africans trapped in that same town. And for them, this wasn't a story of British pluck. It was a story of starvation. And you don't have to take my word for it. The brutal math here comes directly from Baden-Powell's own diary. Right at the start of the siege, his calculation was crystal clear. For the white population, there was enough food for 134 days, over 4 months. But for the much, much larger African population, just 15 days of food, 2 weeks. And, well, the consequences were as horrific as you'd imagine. And they happened fast. Journalists who were actually there, guys like Angus Hamilton from The Times, they saw exactly what was happening. By February of 1900, he reported that the native population is starving, with about 5 people dying every single day from hunger. The human cost was just staggering. Another correspondent, Emerson Nellie, described seeing what he called living skeletons, people so thin that he described them as black specters. I mean, he saw them just fall down on the ground, too weak to go on. This wasn't just a food shortage. This was a full-blown humanitarian disaster unfolding right there, inside the town. And let's be clear, this wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate, systematic policy. Step 1, make Africans pay handsomely, as they put it,
For food, sometimes for food that had been taken from their own stores. Step 2, cut off rations entirely for any African refugees. Step 3, if starving people were caught stealing food, they were flogged, and some were even executed. And finally, refugees were forced into this impossible choice. You either starve to death inside the town, or you take your chances running past the Boer guns outside. The historian Thomas Pakenham called it a leave here or starve here policy. Basically, a death sentence either way.
Okay, so now let's contrast that grim reality with what happened the second the siege was lifted. Because while hundreds of Africans were dead or dying from starvation in Mafeking, London was getting ready for what was probably the biggest party of the century. Right, we talked about this. The celebrations were so unbelievably intense that they literally changed the English language. The verb to maffick was born, describing that wild public celebration that just swept the nation. It's a word that's still in the dictionary today, all because of this one night. So picture it. It's the night of May 18th, 1900. Huge crowds are flooding the streets of London. They're waving flags. They're celebrating like crazy. After all those humiliating defeats, Britain finally had a victory to cheer about. And the relief of this tiny, remote town was treated like it was this massive turning point in the war, a huge win for the empire. And in the aftermath, a relief fund was set up for the, quote, heroic white defenders of Mafeking. The public donated £29,000, which, just to be clear, was an absolutely enormous sum of money back then. All of it to help the soldiers and settlers who'd made it through the siege. So what about the African families who were devastated by this policy, the ones who had been systematically starved? Well, of that £29,000, not a single penny went to them. Nothing. Their suffering, their sacrifice, it was just completely erased from the story. But the story doesn't actually end there. The cultural aftershocks of Mafeking are in their own way just as complex and contradictory as the siege itself. And they created these legacies that, believe it or not, still exist today. So, Baden-Powell comes back to Britain as a national hero, a total superstar. And during the siege, he'd done something interesting. He organized the local boys into a cadet corps to act as messengers and lookouts. And he was so impressed by their courage and their resourcefulness that it became a key inspiration for him to found the Boy Scouts. Yeah, that whole global movement. But the siege also inspired something, well, something a lot stranger. It was called the Mafeking Mooch. For years after the siege, some British men would walk with this exaggerated limp, pretending they'd been injured heroically serving at Mafeking, all just to get a little sympathy and respect. And that's the paradox, isn't it? From this one single siege, you get two completely different legacies. On one hand, you get the Boy Scouts, a global movement founded on principles of duty and resourcefulness. And on the other, you get the Mafeking Mooch, a cultural fad based on straight-up lying to get sympathy. It just goes to show you how complicated and powerful the myth of Mafeking really became. So when we look back at Mafeking today, we're really faced with two stories that just don't fit together. And the one we've chosen to remember for so long, well, it says a lot about how we tell these kinds of histories. And in the end, it really leaves us with a fundamental question. The story of Baden-Powell's incredible pluck and the cheering, Mafeking crowds, that became the legend. But the story of the living skeletons, as they were called, that story was buried. And it forces us to ask a really important question. Whose story gets to become history? And maybe more importantly, what's the cost of forgetting the ones that don't?